The Gap had been a crossing since before anyone thought to name it. The Cherokee knew it first, a notch in the Pine Mountain ridge where the stone relented just enough to let a path through, a place where the high wall of the mountain could be crossed without going over the top of it. Then the Long Hunters, then the settlers moving west into Kentucky, then the railroad, then the highway. 200 years of people using the Gap because the Gap was there and the mountain wasn't going to move to accommodate them, and the Gap was the only way through. Route 23 runs through Pound Gap now at 4 lanes, a clean, modern highway that carries traffic between Wise County, Virginia and Letcher County, Kentucky, with the ordinary efficiency of a road that has been built to forget the terrain it crosses. The guardrails are standard, the signage is standard. The painted stripe in the middle of the road that marks the state line is standard, a thin painted band of white across the asphalt at the Gap's midpoint, the kind of marking that appears on state boundaries everywhere and that most drivers cross without registering it as anything more than a formality. The road crew that arrived at Pound Gap on a Tuesday in late November knew the stripe was there. They knew they were crossing between 2 states when they crossed it. They knew the job site spanned both sides of the line. What they didn't know, what most of them didn't know, was why nobody had worked the Gap past dark in 40 years. They found out. Denny Ratliff had been leading road crews in Wise County since he was 32, which meant he'd been doing it for 12 years and had done most categories of road work in most categories of weather on most categories of terrain the Southwest Virginia mountains could produce. He was not a man who was surprised by jobs going sideways. Jobs went sideways. The mountain didn't care about your schedule, and the weather didn't care about your equipment manifest, and the only thing you could do was adapt the plan to the conditions and get the work done safely. He arrived at the Gap at 7 in the morning with 4 crew members and a maintenance truck and a flatbed carrying the guardrail sections that were going to replace the deteriorated stretch on the Virginia approach. The job had been estimated at 6 hours. It was the kind of estimate that looked reasonable on paper and less reasonable on a steep November approach in the high 30s with a frozen ground complicating the anchor work. He stepped out of the truck and looked at the Gap in the early morning. The ridge rose on both sides of the notch, Pine Mountain pressing in from the east and west, the rock cut of the highway passing through the tightest point of the Gap where the mountain had been blasted back to make room for the road. In the low November light, with the leaves entirely off the trees and the ridge bare against a gray sky, the Gap looked like what it was, a wound in the mountain, a place where something had been forced through. He looked at his watch. 7:15. 6 hours of work, they'd be done by 1:30, 2 at the latest. He did not look at the Gap again with any particular attention for the rest of the morning. There was no reason to. Kayla Owens set up the traffic control on the Virginia approach and spent the morning in the rhythm that traffic control required, the sustained vigilance of watching for vehicles, managing the 1-lane alternating flow around the work zone, the physical and mental repetition of a job that looked simple from the outside and wasn't. She was good at it. She had been doing it for 3 years, and she had the specific attentiveness that the work required, and that became, after enough years, a kind of ambient awareness, a constant low-level monitoring of everything in her field of view for things that were wrong or about to be wrong. By noon, she had noticed several things that were not wrong but were interesting. The Gap had a quality to it that she hadn't encountered on other mountain jobs. Not threatening, just particular. The way sound moved through the notch was different from the way sound moved on an open road. The engine noise from passing vehicles compressed strangely in the cut. The tool noise from the crew bounced off the rock walls in ways that made it difficult to localize. And the wind in the Gap was its own thing, coming through the notch from the Kentucky side and hitting the Virginia approach with a consistency and direction that didn't match the wind anywhere else on the job site. She noted these things the way she noted everything, as conditions to be aware of. She kept working. Burl Meade ran the equipment and said almost nothing for the first 4 hours, which was not unusual. Burl was not a talker. He was a man who communicated primarily in the quality of the work he did and the specific efficiency of how he moved equipment. And the work and the efficiency were both excellent, as they always were. He had been operating heavy equipment on Virginia road jobs since 1989, and he knew every type of road work in the district, and he knew Pound Gap specifically, though he had not worked it in a long time. He had made sure, before this job, not to work it. He had managed his schedule around it for years with the quiet deliberateness of a man who understood a specific risk and took specific measures to avoid it. He had not been given a choice about this job. Short-staffed, specific equipment certification required, Danny's request personal and direct. He had said yes because saying no would have required an explanation he didn't want to give in a dispatcher's office to people who wouldn't have believed it. He had told himself they would be done by 2. By noon, looking at the progress and the remaining work in the shortened November daylight, he revised this estimate significantly and began thinking about what he was going to say and when he was going to say it. Marcus Webb was 26 years old and in his first year on a road crew and entirely without the local knowledge that would have made him careful about this particular job on this particular gap on this particular ridge. He was from Appalachia, Virginia, 20 miles south, and he had grown up in the mountains and knew them in the general way of someone who had lived among them his whole life without knowing them in the specific way that certain pieces of ground required. He was good at the work, eager to be useful and entirely without the information that would have changed his behavior at several key moments in the afternoon. He was also, by the end of the day, the reason any of them got off the gap at all. This is one of the things about luck. The same quality that put him in the wrong place put him in the right place to see what needed to be seen, and the luck that kept him on the right side of the line was thinner than any of them wanted to think about afterward. The day went the way days went on mountain road jobs in late November. The ground was harder than the estimate assumed, which slowed the anchor work. A bolt pattern on the new guardrail sections didn't match the template in the equipment manifest, which required a call to the supply yard and a 40-minute wait for confirmation of the correct hardware. The hardware was correct. The delay was not. By 2 o'clock, Danny recalculated. Done by 4:30, he told the crew. By 3:30, looking at what remained, he revised to 5, maybe 5:15. The light in the gap was already going by 3:30. The ridge on both sides blocking the low November sun before it had any business setting, creating a premature dusk in the notch that had the crew reaching for headlamps before 4. At 3:55, Burl walked over to Danny. He said, "We need to be off this gap before dark." Danny said, "We'll be close." Burl looked at him. He said, "Close isn't off." Danny was looking at the remaining guardrail sections and doing the arithmetic. He said, 40 minutes, maybe 50. We've got enough light. Burl said, "The light in this gap goes faster than it looks, and what I'm saying isn't about the light." Danny said, "Burl, we're almost done." Burl looked at the gap. He looked at the notch in the ridge where the highway passed through, already in full shadow even though the sky above it was still pale. He thought about what he should say and in what order. He had been thinking about this for several hours, and he had not arrived at a version of the telling that he expected Danny to receive well. He said, "Finish as fast as you can." He went back to the equipment. He should have said more. He understood this as he walked back. He told himself he would say more at 4:30 if they weren't done. He told himself he would say the full thing, the history, the crew 40 years ago, the man found on the wrong side of the line if it looked like they were going to be working past dark. 4:30 came and they were not done, and the light in the gap was gone, and the crew was working by headlamp and vehicle lights, and Burl went back to Danny and said the thing he should have said at noon. The full thing, as Burl told it standing at the Virginia approach of Pound Gap at 4:45 in the November dark with the vehicle lights throwing long shadows up the rock walls. There had been a crew working the gap in the fall of 1983. Guardrail work, same as this. The gap chewed up guardrail regularly. The freeze-thaw cycle and the traffic load doing what they did to metal on a mountain highway. 6 men. The crew lead was a man named Harold Sutherland, who had been working this district since the 1960s and who knew about the gap the way certain men know about certain places, from being told, from paying attention, and from the accumulated understanding of a man who had spent 20 years in these mountains and understood that some of what the mountains held was not in any manual. Harold Sutherland told his crew about the gap before they started. He told them the rule. They were not working past dark. He told them why, in plain language of a man who had decided plain language was more effective than explanation when the explanation involved things that people didn't have categories for. He said, "There is something in this gap that comes out after dark. I don't know what it is. I know what it does. We are not here when it comes out." The crew had taken this in the way that crews took things told to them by experienced foremen. Seriously, because Harold Sutherland was serious, without necessarily believing the specific content, because the specific content was the kind of thing that adult men in the late 20th century were not equipped to believe without direct evidence. They started the job at 7. They were not done by dark. One of the crew, a young man, first year from Clintwood, crossed the state line at the gap's midpoint to retrieve equipment left on the Kentucky side. He crossed after dark. He did not come back across. They found him the next morning, on the Virginia side, which was the side he had left from, not the side he had crossed to, 100 yards south of the gap, in the brush below the highway shoulder. No injuries consistent with a fall, no injuries at all by the medical examiner's report, except for the ones that couldn't be explained by any mechanism the examiner had language for. Harold Sutherland's incident report said, "Crew member disoriented in the dark, lost footing on the approach, sustained injuries." He wrote it in the plain language of a man who understood that plain language was also more effective than the truth, when the truth involved things that incident reports had no category for. Harold Sutherland retired the following spring. He died in 2001. His daughter, who had heard the real version, had told her children, and the story had been in the county since. Burrell had been told by Harold Sutherland directly in 1985, sitting in a truck at a different job site, in the specific way that men who knew things about the mountains passed those things along, without preamble, without drama, in the tone of someone transferring information that the recipient needed to have. He had believed it because Harold Sutherland was Harold Sutherland, and Harold Sutherland didn't make things up. He had managed his schedule around Pound Gap after dark for 38 years. Danny listened to all of it. He was a practical man, and what Burrell was telling him was not practical, and he was standing in the dark on a mountain highway with 4 miles of Virginia mountain on one side and 4 miles of Kentucky mountain on the other, and the notch of the gap above him, and the vehicle lights making hard shadows on the rock walls, and Burrell's face in those lights was the face of a man who was not telling a story. Burrell's face was the face of a man reporting a condition. Danny said, "What do we do?" Burrell said, "We finish from the Virginia side only. We leave the Kentucky side equipment. We get off this gap in the next 10 minutes. Danny said, "We're 20 minutes from done." Burrell said, "We're not doing 20 more minutes on this gap tonight." Danny looked at the remaining work. He looked at the gap. He looked at Burrell. He said, "All right, pack it up. We come back in the morning." He turned to call the crew. That was when Kayla said, "There's something on the ridge." She had been watching it for several minutes before she said anything because she had spent the afternoon watching for things that were wrong, and she had a protocol for wrong things that started with verifying before reporting. She had been verifying. It was on the ridge to the east, the Virginia side, moving along the ridgeline above the gap in the bare November canopy, visible in the vehicle headlights that were angled up the slope, intermittently in the gaps between the trees. Large, moving with a deliberateness that she had been trying to categorize for the past several minutes, and then she could not categorize. Not a bear. Bears moved with a specific randomness, a stop-and-go interest in the terrain that this was not. Not a deer. The movement was not the 4-point locomotion of a deer. 2 points, upright, moving steadily toward the cut in the rock, toward the gap. She said, "There's something on the ridge, east side, moving toward the gap." They all looked, in the headlight beams angled up the slope, in the intermittent gaps in the bare canopy. They could see it, or they could see the suggestion of it, the movement of something large and deliberate in the tree line above them, moving along the ridge toward the notch. It was not hurrying. It was moving the way something moves when it knows where it is going and is not concerned about the time it takes to get there. Burrell said, "Vehicles, now, Virginia side, go south." Danny was already moving. He called to Marcus. He called to the 4th crew member, a quiet man named Pete, who had been working the Virginia anchor bolts and who came at Danny's voice without asking questions because Danny's voice had a quality in it that Pete had not heard before and that required new interpretation. Burrell was at the equipment vehicle. He was moving with the speed of a man half his age. Danny looked for Marcus. Marcus was on the Kentucky side of the state line. He had crossed back to retrieve the last piece of equipment, a torque wrench that he had set down on the Kentucky approach 40 minutes ago and that he had remembered at the worst possible moment. He was on the wrong side of the line, 40 feet from the nearest vehicle, with the painted white stripe between him and where he needed to be. Danny called to him. He called loud with the specific authority of a crew lead who needs someone to move right now without hesitation or question. He said, "Marcus, cross the line. Come across now. Don't look at the gap. Come to the truck." Danny heard him. He started moving toward the line. He looked at the gap. He has described what he saw at the gap on 11 separate occasions in the 3 years since November. Each description is consistent with the others in its essential elements and varies only in the language he reaches for. The words he tries and discards because they are not right. The approximations he settles on because approximations are all he has. What he conveys consistently in every telling. The gap, the notch in the rock where the highway passed through the ridge, had changed quality. In the daylight, it was a cut in the stone, the product of highway construction, the negative space of removed rock. In the dark, with the vehicle lights on the Virginia approach and his own position on the Kentucky side, the gap was framed differently. The rock walls on both sides, the road passing through, the darkness in the notch. And in the darkness of the notch, at the point where the road entered the gap from the Kentucky side, something was in the gap. He cannot describe it with specificity. He has tried. What he can describe is the quality of it, the way the gap at that moment looked like a mouth, not a cave mouth, not a geological opening. The specific quality of a mouth, the framing of the rock walls, the thing in the gap the way a tongue is in a mouth, the sense of the gap as an aperture that opened into something, and that the something in it was not stone. He said on the first telling to Danny, sitting in the truck going south on Route 23, "It had teeth. I don't mean I saw teeth. I mean the gap looked like it had teeth, like the gap was the teeth." He said, whatever was in the gap was what the gap was for. He crossed the line before it came through. He does not know this with certainty. He ran when he looked away, and he was in the truck, and the truck was moving before he had processed what he'd seen. But Burl told him afterward, sitting in a parking lot in Norton an hour later, that 30 more seconds and he would have been on the wrong side when the thing in the gap came through. Burl said, what gets caught on the wrong side of that line after dark doesn't come back to the right side on its own. He said, not intact. He said it in the tone of Harold Sutherland telling him in a truck in 1985, the tone of information transfer, the tone of a man making sure the person across from him had what they needed to have. The incident report Danny filed cited equipment issues and a decision to defer completion to the following day in the interest of crew safety given the late hour and road conditions. The report mentioned nothing else. The following morning, a different crew was dispatched to complete the guardrail work. The dispatch note said first light start. Complete by 1500, no exceptions. The note said weather closure risk after dark. The forecast showed nothing. The crew lead for the morning crew was a woman named Sandra Combs, who'd worked the district for 14 years. When she read the dispatch note and saw the site was Pound Gap, she read it twice, and then she called her crew together in the parking lot before they got in the vehicles, and she told them the rules. She did not tell them where she had learned the rules or from whom. She told them the rules the way the rules were always told, simply, directly, in the tone of information rather than story. She said, "We are off this gap by 3, regardless of where we are in the job. If we're not done, we come back tomorrow morning, non-negotiable." The youngest member of the crew, a woman 3 months on the job from Norton, asked why. Sandra looked at her. She said, "Because there are places in these mountains with rules. Pound Gap has rules. The rule at Pound Gap is that you don't work past dark. You don't cross the state line after dark. You don't look at the gap after dark." The young woman said, "What's in the gap?" Sandra thought about this. She thought about Harold Sutherland's daughter, who had told her mother, who had told Sandra's aunt, who had told Sandra at a kitchen table in Coburn when Sandra was 22 and new to this work. She thought about the shape of the telling across the years, the way it had moved from person to person, the way necessary information moved in these mountains, directly, person to person, without the intermediary of anything that would have made it seem less real. She said, "Something that has been in that gap since before there was a road. since before there was a crossing, something that lives in the seam between Virginia and Kentucky and that has its own rules about who crosses after dark and when and how. She said, "You follow the rules or you deal with what doesn't follow them." The young woman nodded. They drove to the gap. They arrived at first light. They were done by 11:45 and off the gap by noon, and Sandra Combs did not let herself breathe fully until they were 3 miles south on Route 23, and the gap was behind them, and the November morning was ordinary in the way that only things you've left behind can be ordinary. Danny Ratliff drives Route 23 twice a week. His commute takes him through Pound Gap every Tuesday and Friday, south to north in the morning and north to south in the evening. He drives it in the daylight. He has rearranged his schedule twice in the past 3 years to ensure he crosses the gap during daylight hours. His wife knows he does this and has not asked why, because the one time she asked, he told her, and she stopped asking and started checking his schedule herself. He has not worked a job at Pound Gap since November. When a dispatch comes through for gap work, he finds a reason it should go to a different crew. The dispatchers have noticed. They have not said anything because Danny Ratliff has 30 years of credibility in this district, and a man with 30 years of credibility who doesn't want to work a specific site is a man with a reason. Marcus Webb transferred to the district office in Abingdon in January. His transfer request cited personal reasons. He has not returned to Wise County for any job that requires working on Route 23. He still drives it. He has no choice. It's the most direct road. He drives through the gap with the specific, focused calm of a man who has decided to be exactly one thing: moving. He crosses the state line stripe at highway speed, and he does not look at the gap, and he has not looked at the gap since the night in November. He thinks about looking every time. He doesn't. Burl Meade retired in December. His party was at a diner in Norton. He ate the chicken and had a piece of the cake, and when someone asked him what the most memorable job of his career was, he said, "The one I should have spoken up on sooner." He said it in a way that ended the question, and he went home, and he has not driven Route 23 since his last day of work. He doesn't need to. He doesn't go that direction anymore. The guardrail on the Virginia approach to Pound Gap was completed the following morning and is in excellent structural condition. The maintenance schedule shows it due for inspection in 3 years. The inspection will be scheduled for a morning start with a hard afternoon cutoff. Whoever dispatches it will know why. They will have been told, in a parking lot or a break room or a truck cab, by someone who was told by someone who was told, going back to Harold Sutherland standing in a truck in 1985, transferring information to a man named Burl Meade who needed to have it. The telling is how the rules survive. The gap doesn't tell anyone anything. The gap doesn't need to. The gap has been there since before the road, since before the crossing, since before any name was put on it or any paint stripe divided it into Virginia and Kentucky. It will be there when the road is gone. The rules will still apply. Whatever is in the seam of that mountain, whatever has lived in the space between 2 states since before the states existed, since before the names, since before the first person found the gap and used it to get through the mountain, it does not need the rules to be written down. It only needs the people who cross the gap to know them. Most of the time, they do. Most of the time is enough.